But let's go ahead and move on past TGI Friday. Perfect Strangers was actually probably the best show, and I think that predated TGI. But anyways, let's move past Perfect Strangers. Let's move past TGI Friday altogether. Let's move on to this theory. Now, this segment was originally supposed to be in an earlier episode. I had it planned on the same episode I talked about yoni eggs, and I was like, I'll split it up, because otherwise it just feels like I'm talking too much about vaginas for 30 minutes. I actually got my first bad review, actually. I got a bad review. I got a 1-star review for my yoni egg episode. Yeah, you're bound to get them. It doesn't bother me. I've gotten bad reviews in real life. But I just thought it was funny that was the episode that set somebody off. All the stuff I've covered, and it was the egg one. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to premenstrual syndrome. So let's hop in the dead rabbit dirigible. Let's hop in the rabbit rowboat. We've been using the dirigible too much. So we're going to row all the way from Little Oregon, little dotted line on a map, dun 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 dun, and then we go to the Bermuda Triangle because we have to go back in time. This is like a 10-day journey. And now we're back in time. We're going to row all the way to Greece. And there we're going to meet Hippocrates. I do know how to pronounce his name. We're going to meet Hippocrates. We're in the year 2,500 years ago. So whatever that is. Hippocrates is checking out this woman. Not sexually, because he's a doctor. He's a professional. He has his little stick with the snakes on it. They're constantly biting people. He hasn't tamed them yet. This is back in olden times. And he's like waving this stick with the snakes on it around, trying to diagnose this woman. And she's like, I'm going to kill you. Head spinning around, throwing up. And he's like, she's suffering from hysteria. And the other doctors are like, oh, that's interesting. That sounds like a word you just made up. And he goes, I did just make that word up. You like it? You think it's going to catch on? And they're like, yeah, it's a pretty catchy word. What does it mean, though? He goes, it means that her uterus has become detached from where it should be in her body, which, as we've covered in the Yoni Egg episode, I'm really not sure where that is. Anyways, the uterus becomes detached from her body and begins floating around her like a Plinko machine. And they're like, what's Plinko? And he's like, settle down. I'll tell you all about Plinko later. It's going to bounce around her body. And it's because the moon is detached, like the gravity of the moon is detaching the uterus so it can float around in them. It's making her irritable. It's making her swollen. It's making her not a very nice person. She's hysterical. And all the doctors are like, Hippo, you did it again, Hippo. They pour a bunch of Gatorade over his head. He's like, yeah. Lift him up on their shoulders, take him to the Colosseum. So that was in Rome. So it's been quite a journey. But anyways, he diagnosed her with hysteria. Now, this was a thing that was believed. What I find fascinating about the theory is that somehow they know enough about science that they know the moon has a gravitational pull on the planet, but don't know enough to know the uterus doesn't float around in a human body. That theory lasted until about the 1900s. Like, I mean, people, I don't know if they always thought they're like, oh, a woman's cranky, and they're like, where's your uterus today? And she's like, shut up. I don't know if they necessarily believed that the uterus is floating around, but they did believe that women would get cranky and irritable and have pains because the uterus could get stuck like under their armpit. And they're like, oh, my breast is swollen. And they're like, do you want me to punch your uterus down? And they're like, no, I'm totally fine. So, and in 1931, though, there was an American gynecologist named Robert Frank, and he came out with this study called The Hormonal Causes of Premenstrual Tension, which oddly rhymes and is a great band name, Premenstrual Tension. He did say, listen, this is what's going on. There's some sort of issues with the uterus, and it's causing these things. We think it's related not to the moon, but to a woman's natural period, which would make sense. You would connect it to the moon because, like, the lunar cycle, the month, but it's not like the gravitational pull is lifting parts of your body out. And what it does is it causes irritability, bloating, fatigue, depression, attacks of pain, nervousness, restlessness, and, in his words, the impulse for foolish and ill-considered actions. So, if you see a woman out gambling the house away, it's because she was on her period. In 1953, there was a British physician known as Katharina Dalton, which sounds like a romance, like a character out of a romance novel, but anyway, she was a real person. She said, listen, this is what's going on. I'm going to call it premenstrual syndrome. It's a fluctuation of estrogen and proestrogen. That's the estrogen that really knows its game, really stepped up. They get paid for it. And this is what she listed as. So at this point, you're thinking, Jason, you're just reading us off facts. But I'm getting to something. And that's kind of, sometimes you do have to read off facts. But in 1953, and what's weird, because that's incredibly recent. Before that, I mean, figure first they thought just the uterus was bouncing around like a pinball. And then some guy's like, oh no, it has a couple symptoms. And then in 1953, premenstrual syndrome was named, and it had things like anxiety, sadness, moodiness, constipation or diarrhea. This is all going to be important here. Feeling out of control, insomnia, food cravings, increased sex drive, anger, arguments with family or friends, poor judgment, lack of physical coordination, decreased efficiency, increased personal strength or power, feelings of connection to nature or to other women, seizures, convulsions, asthma attacks, flare-ups in asthma, allergies, sinusitis, anxiety disorders, irritable bowel syndrome, migraines, and sometimes multiple sclerosis. Now, this is the problem. There are so many symptoms that people are now saying there's no such thing as PMS. There is a physical component to it which can cause bloating and cramping. So as a woman's listening to this podcast, I'm sure she's already shut it off. But if a woman's listening to this podcast doubled over her toilet, yes, you're having physical symptoms. And she's like, thanks a lot, jackass. I know that. But there's physical symptoms. The question of, is PMS real? Is all those emotional systems and stuff like constipation or diarrhea? So basically, anything other than normal, you can chalk it up to this. You can have decreased efficiency or increase in personal power. Like, it's one of those things. It's like a fortune cookie that's so vague, you can attribute anything to it. They do these studies, and I'm just reading these studies because I don't have PMS. It's not an issue that is a personal concern to me. But they've done all these studies, and they've decided, the scientific community has come to these conclusions. 97% of women suffer from PMS, or 5%. Only 5% do. Because there are women who have severe emotional problems when they're on their period. But it's nowhere near the amount that people say. And reading these articles was really fascinating. I don't even remember why I decided to look into this. I think it was because I was researching the yoni egg thing and they were talking about it, working with PMS stuff and all that. But it was this rabbit hole that I was going into. Because you have people saying, listen, here's the thing. If you go to work and you're grumpy and your boss yells at you and you get even more grumpy and you're driving home and you feel super irritable and it's not near your period, you chalk it up to a bad day. But if it is near your period, you're like, I'm just going through PMS. They say when they take young girls aside and they do the health ed classes, they'll say your body's going to be going through some changes. You're going to start having this thing that happens every month. You're going to feel moody. You're going to feel cranky. You're actually putting these symptoms into their head. It would be the equivalent of in health ed class for boys, you said, every time you get a hard-on, you're going to get a splitting headache. You will have people develop that symptoms. And if in the media, whenever someone's like cranky in a show, they're like, oh, she just PMSing, or she's like, I'm on a really bad period. I don't know what sitcom that is. It's not Family Matters. But, you know, the thing that if you keep reinforcing this belief, it will reinforce it in you. If every boy is told every time they get an erection, they will have a splitting headache, you will have a sizable amount of the population who will psychosomatically have a splitting headache every time they have an erection, which would be absolute hell. And the theory is that that's what's been going on with this. They said there are way too many symptoms that everyone's going to have at least one or two or three of these, and they'll be like, I'm just PMSing, I'm irritable, I am excited with power, I can bond well with women, and I have diarrhea. And the other woman's like, that's weird, because I'm constipated, and I feel more in touch with nature, and I'm restless, and I also have PMS. There's just way too many. There is a thing called premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which they say 3 to 8% of women have. It's like 11 different symptoms, and if you have any 5 of them, you have that. It's something you can be classified for and things like that. And those are more concise. So they're not like super all over the place. And they said you have to have In most of your menstrual cycles during the past year, 5 of the 11 symptoms plus 1 of the first 4 listed, which is like moodiness, hopelessness, anxiety, tension, stuff like that. So there's not like, it's not all over the place. But this isn't settled science. And it's funny because people get really, really touchy about this. I know I'm talking about this the wrong time of the month, but people are getting really, really touchy about this. Here's a list of the headlines that I've read I didn't just read the headlines. Here's a list of the headlines of articles I read while I was prepping this episode. Is PMS a myth? This researcher says yes, and that it's holding women back. Next headline. Is PSM real or a myth? Moodiness around periods is an excuse, psychologist argues. Next one. Of course PMS is real. The real question is why we don't have a cure. Next one. Should you get time off for PMS? So it's all over the place and no one can agree to it because it's so ingrained in society that this is a real thing and that people suffer from it. Again, they're not focusing on I know constipation and or diarrhea is physical, but there's the bloating and there's like the cramps. That's one thing that they're looking at. But when they look at all these other symptoms, they're saying, that's just bad timing. You just happen to have diarrhea while you're cramping at the same time, which sounds quite horrible. They've also done studies. Women in China, when they're on their periods, become super susceptible to cold. They get cold really easy. And in America, that's not a symptom. And they go, if it's a biological mechanism, it shouldn't matter what culture you're in. It should be the same across cultures. If it's biological, why does one group of people get super cold and another group of people don't? So that's another reason why they don't think it's biological. It's one of those things that's so funny because I thought it was settled science. I thought that it was something like you're on your period and you're just grumpy and that's it. And it happens. Because I think you would be grumpy if you were cramping up too. But they're saying that all the other moodiness and stuff like that are basically all in your head. All in your head. Or, a better way to put it, maybe they're just being hysterical. That was a clip from our daily podcast, Dead Rabbit Radio. Dead Rabbit Radio is available anywhere that you listen to podcasts. It's daily paranormal, conspiracy, and true crime news. If you want to hear the full episode that this clip came from, check the link below. Please like and subscribe. And hit that little bell, too. That does some magical stuff. Thanks, guys.